Laurent Beaumont stood at the window of his Paris apartment in the Marais district and looked down at the illuminated streets below. It was March 3rd, 2023, and in exactly 4 days he would marry Céline Moreau, the woman he had loved for 3 years. The woman who had shown him that love was more than just a word from romantic movies. The woman with whom he wanted to build a future that would last for generations. Laurent was 29 years old, a software developer at an up-and-coming tech company in La Défense, and came from a family that valued stability above all else. His father, Philippe Beaumont, had worked as a notary for 38 years before retiring. His mother, Isabelle, had been an elementary school teacher and had raised Laurent and his 2 sisters with a mixture of strictness and unconditional love. The family home in Versailles, where Laurent had grown up, exuded history and tradition. Every room told of generations who had kept promises once made. His childhood in this house had shaped Laurent. On Sundays, everyone always gathered for lunch, a ritual that was never broken. His maternal grandfather, Jean-Claude, had come to France from Algeria and built a small construction company with nothing but hope and a willingness to work. He often told Laurent stories about the importance of honesty and loyalty, about how a man must keep his word, no matter what the cost. These lessons were engraved in Laurent's DNA. He had met Céline in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, at a virtual art workshop. She was a graphic designer, worked for an advertising agency in Paris, and had this incredible ability to see the world through different eyes. While everyone else saw only chaos, she found patterns and beauty. Their first real meeting took place in a small café in Saint-Germain-des-Prés after the restrictions were eased. Laurent still remembered that moment clearly when she walked in, her dark brown hair tied in a loose bun, a smile that made him feel like the sun was finally shining again after months of darkness. Their relationship developed slowly and deliberately. They shared an apartment on Rue des Archives, a cozy old building with high ceilings and wooden beams that smelled of lavender and freshly baked bread. Céline loved to cook French home-style food that she had learned from her grandmother in Brittany. Laurent took care of the plants that lined their windowsill and worked on personal coding projects in the evenings, while Céline sat at her drawing table and sketched illustrations. They talked about children, about a house outside Paris, perhaps in Fontainebleau, with a garden where their future children could play. They talked about their values, about loyalty, about the importance of family. Céline told him about her parents, who had divorced after 25 years of marriage, and how much that had hurt her as a teenager. She vowed that she would never let a family break up like that. The proposal came in December 2022, during a weekend trip to Lyon. Laurent had planned everything, a private dinner in a restaurant overlooking the Saône, a violinist playing discreetly in the background. When he got down on one knee and pulled out the ring he had saved up for months to buy, Céline cried. Not just a few tears, but real tears, with sobs and a smile that lit up her whole face. But there was something Laurent didn't know. While he was planning the wedding, talking to florists, choosing menus and thinking about vows, Céline was leading a double life that would destroy his entire reality. The cracks began in January 2023, subtle and almost invisible. Céline started coming home late more often, explaining it away with projects at work and deadlines that had to be met. Her phone was suddenly always face down on the table, and she took calls in the bathroom. Laurent noticed, but dismissed it. Every relationship had phases where stress and work overshadowed intimacy. That was normal, he told himself. Then came February 28th. Laurent had returned from a business trip to Marseille earlier than expected. It was late in the evening, around 11 p.m., and when he entered the apartment, he heard voices coming from the bedroom. Not only Céline's voice, but also that of a man he recognized immediately. It was the voice of Mathieu Dubois, his best friend since school, the man he had asked to be his best man. Laurent stood frozen in the hallway. His mind refused to accept the obvious. Maybe they were planning a surprise for the wedding. Maybe Mathieu was helping Céline with something. But then he heard the laughter, intimate and quiet, the rustling of fabric, a moan that left no room for doubt. He didn't open the door. Instead, he left the apartment as quietly as he had come and walked through the night streets of Paris, aimlessly without a plan. Hours later, he found himself on the banks of the Seine, staring at the dark water and trying to understand what had just happened. The next few days were torture. Laurent said nothing. He watched Céline wake up in the morning, clutching her coffee cup, talking about flower arrangements for the wedding. He watched Mathieu when they met to discuss the final details for the bachelor party, and saw Mathieu look him in the eye and smile as if nothing had happened. Laurent began to investigate. He secretly installed an app on Céline's laptop that recorded her activities. What he found destroyed him. Emails between Céline and Mathieu dating back months. Not just sexual messages, but plans, conversations about a future together, discussions about how they would tell Laurent the truth after the wedding. They weren't planning to end the affair. They were planning to leave Laurent, but only after the wedding had taken place, so that Céline could benefit from the expensive gifts and money Laurent's family had spent on the celebration. It was the coldness of this calculation that shocked Laurent the most. Not the passion, not the mistake in a moment of weakness, but the months of systematic deception. They had even made fun of him, of his naivety, of his romantic gestures. Laurent felt something break inside him. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly and definitively. The world as he knew it no longer existed. The love he had believed in had been a lie. The friendship he had built on had been a fraud. And the future he had so carefully planned was nothing but an illusion. On March 3rd, 4 days before the wedding, Laurent made a decision. He would not confront her. He would not scream or cry or ask for explanations. He would wait, he would watch, and he would plan. The Bachelorette party was planned for March 5th, 2 days before the wedding. Céline and her friends had booked a weekend at a luxurious country house in Champagne, about an hour and a half from Paris. It was to be an elegant celebration, not a vulgar party night, but a weekend of spa treatments, good wine, and conversations about the future. What Laurent had discovered through his surveillance was that Mathieu would also be there. Not officially, but secretly, late on Saturday evening, when the other women were already drunk or in bed. It was to be their last meeting before the wedding, one last time before Céline officially became a married woman. Laurent planned meticulously. He took March 5 off work, told Céline he would be out with his friends, and rented a car under a false name. He bought a knife, not a big one, but sharp enough. He knew where the key to the country house was hidden. Céline had casually mentioned it when she was talking about the plans. He played the scenario over and over in his head. He would not act impulsively. He would wait until the right moment came, until he saw them together, until there was no doubt. Then he would act. Forensic psychologists would later debate whether Laurent was still of sound mind at that moment. The answer was complex. He was rational enough to plan, but emotionally so devastated that his moral compass had completely disappeared. In his perception, this was not revenge. It was justice. They had destroyed his life. They had made a fool of him. They had trampled on everything he believed in. On the evening of March 4th, Laurent sat in his apartment looking at photos. Photos of him and Céline in Lyon, on the beach in Brittany, at Christmas dinner with his family. Photos of him and Mathieu as teenagers, at soccer games, at graduation, at concerts. Each picture felt like a lie, like an artifact from a life that had never been real. He didn't cry. He felt strangely calm, almost peaceful. Tomorrow it would all be over. Tomorrow he would bring the truth to light in a way that no one could ignore. What Laurent didn't understand was that he wasn't just going to kill 2 people. He was also going to destroy himself, his family, his future. But at that moment, alone in his apartment, with the knife in his pocket and the plan in his head, he could see nothing but the betrayal and the need to punish it. The night passed slowly. Laurent did not sleep. He sat by the window, waiting for dawn to come, and with it the day that would change his life and the lives of so many others forever. March 5th began with a grey sky over Paris, bathing the city in a diffuse light. Laurent left the apartment at 9 in the morning after Céline had already left. She had kissed him goodbye, her lips warm against his cheek, and wished him a nice weekend with his friends. The matter-of-factness with which she lied had almost made him laugh. Almost. He drove the rented Peugeot out of the underground garage and took the A4 towards Reims. The landscape gradually changed, the urban density giving way to open fields and rolling hills, characteristic of the Champagne region. The country house was located near Épinay, nestled among vineyards that were still bare at this time of year, their vines like black skeletons against the sky. During the drive, Laurent experienced a strange emotional sequence. Moments of absolute clarity alternated with phases of complete dissociation, in which he felt as if he were observing himself from the outside. His hands on the steering wheel seemed foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. The road ahead stretched mechanically, kilometre after kilometre, while his mind played through the same scenarios in endless loops. He remembered a moment 2 years ago when Mathieu had fallen ill with a severe flu that had confined him to bed. Laurent had brought him food every day for a week, sitting with him and watching movies, even though he risked getting infected himself. That had been friendship, he thought, or at least he had believed it was. And Céline. He remembered the night her grandmother died. She had cried in his arms for 3 hours, and he had stroked her hair and promised her that they would get through this together. He had felt her grief as his own and vowed never to leave her alone. How could they do this to him? The question kept drilling through his skull, never finding a satisfactory answer. Laurent reached the village around noon. He parked the car about 1 kilometre from the country house, next to an abandoned barn where it wouldn't be noticed. Then he continued on foot, following a narrow path through the vineyards. The cold March air cut into his lungs, but he hardly felt it. The country house was impressive, a renovated 18th-century building with stone walls and large windows. 3 cars were parked in front of the entrance. Laurent recognized Céline's white Renault immediately. He positioned himself on a hill about 200 meters away, from where he could overlook the house, hidden behind a row of trees. Hours passed. He saw the women moving through the windows, occasionally heard laughter carried to him by the wind. Around 4 p.m., and they left the house all together, dressed for a walk. Laurent seized the opportunity. He moved quickly, reached the house, and found the spare key exactly where Céline had said it would be, under a flower pot next to the back door. The interior was warm and smelled of a fireplace and expensive perfume. Laurent searched the rooms methodically. On the first floor, he found Céline's bag, her phone lying on the nightstand. He checked her messages. The latest was from Mathieu, sent 2 hours ago. "We'll be there at 10 p.m. Can't wait." Laurent put the phone back. He continued searching, finding nothing unusual, until he discovered a notebook in one of the bedroom closets. Céline's handwriting filled the pages. It was a kind of diary, and as he read, he felt the last remnants of his self-control shatter. She wrote about Mathieu with a passion she had never shown Laurent. She described intimate details of their meetings, describing Laurent as sweet but boring, someone who was safe but not exciting. She wrote that the wedding was a safety net, that she needed her in-laws' money to set up a studio for her own design business. The betrayal was not just emotional, it was calculated, financially motivated, cruel in its clarity. Laurent sat down on the bed and stared at the notebook. At that moment, he could still have left. He could have called the police, cancelled the wedding, started his life over, but that possibility no longer existed in his consciousness. The rational part of his mind had fallen silent, replaced by something darker, something that demanded retribution. He left the house before the women returned and hid on the hill again. Night fell early at this time of year. Around 7 p.m., he sat in complete darkness and watched as lights came on in the house and shadows moved behind the curtains. At 9:45 p.m., he saw headlights coming up the street. A black Audi stopped discreetly about 100 yards from the house. Mathieu got out, looked around as if to make sure no one saw him, then moved quickly toward the house. The back door opened, and Céline stood there in her bathrobe, her silhouette against the warm light behind her. Laurent felt nothing, no anger, no sadness, just an icy clarity. He waited 30 minutes. Then he got up and walked to the house. Laurent moved through the darkness like a shadow, his footsteps muffled by the damp grass. The knife was in his jacket pocket, the blade cold against his thigh. The windows on the ground floor were dark. Only on the first floor was there a light on in one of the bedrooms. He knew which one it was. The same room where he had found the notebook. The back door was unlocked. Laurent entered, his eyes taking a moment to adjust to the darkness inside. Muffled voices came from the upper floor, laughter, the intimate whispers of two people who thought they were alone. The other women were apparently already asleep. Their rooms were at the other end of the hallway. Laurent climbed the stairs, each step taking an eternity. His heartbeat was surprisingly calm, his breathing controlled. He felt detached from his body, as if he were playing a role in a movie whose ending had already been written. He stopped in front of the bedroom door. The voices were clearer now. Céline's laughter, bright and carefree. Mathieu's deeper voice, familiar and yet strange. They were talking about the wedding, about the future, about Laurent. "He has no idea," said Mathieu. "Tomorrow at the rehearsal he'll shake my hand and think I'm his best friend." "I feel bad sometimes," replied Céline, but her voice didn't sound guilty, more amused. "But he makes it easy for me. He's so naive, so trusting." "We'll tell him after the wedding," said Mathieu. "By then, he'll have spent all the money on the celebration, and we can live with the knowledge that we at least gave him one happy day." They both laughed. It was that laughter that broke down Laurent's last barrier. He opened the door. The room was dimly lit by candles on the nightstand. Céline and Mathieu were lying in bed, half covered by a blanket, their bodies entwined. For a frozen moment, all three stared at each other, unable to comprehend the reality of what was happening. Céline screamed, pulling the blanket to her chest. Mathieu jumped out of bed, his eyes wide with shock. "Laurent, what are you doing here?" Laurent said nothing. He pulled the knife from his pocket, the blade reflecting the flickering candlelight. His expression was blank, as if someone had sucked all emotion out of him. "Laurent, please," Céline's voice was trembling now. "Let's talk about this. It's not what it looks like." "Not what it looks like." Laurent's voice was little more than a whisper, but it carried a coldness that froze the air in the room. "I read your diary, Céline. I know every plan, every lie, every moment you two laughed at me." Mathieu tried to diffuse the situation. He raised his hands in a conciliatory gesture. "Listen, I know this looks bad, but we can sort this out. No one has to do anything they'll regret." "Regret?" Laurent laughed, a hollow, broken sound. "You were my brother. I would have given my life for you, and you made a fool of me." What happened in the next few minutes would later be analyzed by forensic experts and psychologists. Laurent moved with a speed none of them had expected. Mathieu tried to stop him, grabbed his arm, but Laurent was stronger, driven by a force that came from a dark place he himself did not understand. The knife found its target. Once, twice, 3 times, Mathieu fell to the floor, his hands pressed against his chest, where dark blood seeped between his fingers. His eyes searched Laurent's face, incredulous, as if he still couldn't believe that his best friend had done this to him. Céline screamed, a piercing sound that shattered the silence of the night. She tried to run for the door, but Laurent was faster. He grabbed her arm and pulled her back. Their eyes met, and in that moment she saw not the man she was supposed to marry, but a stranger whose humanity had disappeared. "Why?" she whispered. "Why did you even ask me to marry you if you love me?" "Because I loved you," Laurent replied. "Because I believed in us. But you destroyed everything." The knife fell a fourth time, then a fifth. Céline fell next to Mathieu, her body slackening, her eyes staring at the ceiling, but seeing nothing. Laurent dropped the knife. It landed with a metallic clang on the wooden floor. He looked at his hands covered in blood, and for the first time in hours he felt something. But it wasn't remorse or shock. It was emptiness, an absolute, all-consuming emptiness. Voices rang out in the hallway. The screams had woken the other women. Doors opened, footsteps approached. Laurent didn't move. He just stood there, between the bodies of the two people he had once loved most, waiting for the consequences of his actions to catch up with him. When the police arrived 20 minutes later, they found him sitting against the wall, his clothes soaked with blood. He did not resist arrest, did not say a word, did not look at anyone. There was only silence in his head. For Laurent, the pre-trial detention in the Maison d'Arrêt de Fleury-Mérogis, south of Paris, was a state of suspension. The first 72 hours existed only as fragmented images, fluorescent lights that never went out, the smell of disinfectant and sweat, the metallic click of door locks. He didn't eat, didn't speak, barely responded to the guard's instructions. The emergency psychiatric examination was conducted on the second day. Dr. Amélie Rousseau, an experienced court psychiatrist, sat across from him in a bare interrogation room. Laurent looked right through her, as if she were transparent. "Monsieur Beaumont," she began in a calm voice, "do you understand why you are here?" No answer. His hands lay flat on the metal table, still traces of blood under his fingernails that the cleaning had not completely removed. "Can you tell me what happened on March 5th? Laurent blinked for the first time in hours. His lips moved, forming words so soft that Dr. Rousseau had to lean forward. They laughed. At me. At everything I gave them. Dr. Rousseau wrote something down. "How did you feel when you heard that?" "Nothing. And then everything." His voice was monotonous, mechanical. "I wasn't myself anymore. I was someone else, someone I don't know." The preliminary diagnosis was acute dissociative disorder, triggered by extreme psychological stress. But it would not be enough in court to declare him insane. The planning, the research, the methodical execution spoke against a complete loss of reality. Meanwhile, the news exploded in the media. Double murder before dream wedding. Groom kills unfaithful fiancé and best friend was the headline in Le Parisien. The details were relished, every aspect of the tragedy presented in sensationalist language. Social media immediately became divided. On Twitter, the hashtag Justice for Laurent trended alongside Justice pour Céline. Some argued that Laurent was a victim, driven mad by unspeakable betrayal. Others insisted that no provocation could ever justify murder. The families were devastated. Laurent's parents, Philippe and Isabelle, issued a brief statement. "Our son is not the monster the media is portraying him to be. We don't understand what happened, but we still love him." Their voices broke several times during the press conference. Céline's mother, Marguerite Moreau, a widow from Rennes, was unable to speak. Her statement was read by her lawyer. "My daughter wasn't perfect, but she didn't deserve to die this way. Nothing justifies what Laurent Beaumont did." Mathieu's family remained completely silent, too overwhelmed with grief to make any public statements. The prosecution was led by prosecutor Pierre Duchamp, a man with 25 years of experience and a reputation for uncompromising toughness on violent crime. His position was clear. This was premeditated first-degree murder, planned and carried out in cold blood. The fact that Laurent had been cheated on was irrelevant to the legal assessment. The defense was taken on by Maître Sophie Leclerc, a brilliant criminal defense attorney who specialized in cases with psychological components. Her strategy would be to plead manslaughter in the heat of passion based on extreme emotional distress. The evidence was overwhelming: Laurent's fingerprints on the murder weapon, the DNA material, the witness statements from the other women in the house who had seen him. The digital trail showed the surveillance, the screenshots, the research. Every detail spoke against him. But Maître Leclerc found some points of departure. Céline's diary, the emails between her and Mathieu, the evidence of months of systematic deception. She would argue that this was not ordinary infidelity, but psychological cruelty of such intensity that it had triggered a complete mental breakdown. The trial was set for September 2023, 6 months after the murders. France waited, polarized and fascinated, for a verdict that was more than just a legal judgment. It was a question of how society viewed betrayal, revenge, and the limits of human resilience. The courtroom at the Palais de Justice de Paris was filled to capacity on that September 18, 2023. Journalists, onlookers, relatives of the victims, and Laurent's supporters crowded the benches. The atmosphere was charged, electric, as if the entire French society were breathing through this room. Laurent was led in, his hands cuffed, accompanied by 2 gendarmes. He had lost a lot of weight in recent months. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken. He was wearing a dark suit that his mother had brought him, but he sat there like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Judge Alain Mercier, a man in his late 50s with graying hair and a piercing gaze, opened the proceedings. His voice cut through the murmurs. "Monsieur Beaumont, you are charged with the murder of Céline Moreau and Mathieu Dubois on March 5, 2023. How do you plead?" Laurent stood up, his voice barely audible. "Guilty." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Maître Leclerc shot him a sharp look. She had advised him to plead not guilty, but Laurent had insisted. He wanted no excuses, no technical maneuvers. He had done what he had done. Prosecutor Duchamp opened with a methodical and cold-blooded indictment. He presented the evidence chronologically: the surveillance software Laurent had installed, the screenshots of the emails, the rental of the car under a false name, the purchase of the knife 3 days before the crime. This was not a crime of passion, Duchamp declared as he paced back and forth in front of the jury. This was a man who spent days planning how he would kill 2 people. He had time to think, time to turn back, time to call the police or consult a lawyer. Instead, he chose revenge, cold, calculated revenge. The witness testimony began. One of Céline's friends, Émilie Garnier, described the night of March 5th with a trembling voice. "We heard screams. At first I thought it was an accident. When I opened the door, I saw him just standing there, the blood everywhere. Céline was lying there, and her eyes, they were empty." The forensic experts presented their findings: 8 stab wounds on Mathieu, 6 on Céline. The wounds showed the force and determination with which Laurent had stabbed them. No hesitant cuts, no signs of restraint. Then came the decisive moment. Maître Leclerc called her first witness, Dr. Amélie Rousseau. The psychiatrist explained the concept of acute dissociative disorder to the court. Monsieur Beaumont suffered a complete mental breakdown. When he read his fiancée's diary, in which she described him as boring and useful, when he realized that the wedding was just a means to get money, his entire reality shattered. Duchamp interrupted her during cross-examination. "Dr. Rousseau, you say he lost control, but he was able to rent a car, find a key, wait for hours. Does that sound like someone who has lost control?" Dissociation does not mean that you become incapable of acting, she replied. It means that you are emotionally detached from your own actions. You function, but you are not really present. The court then heard from Laurent's parents. Isabelle Beaumont cried as she described how gentle her son had always been. As a child, he would cry when he saw a dead bird. He couldn't hurt anyone until he himself was hurt so deeply that he broke. But the most emotional testimony came from Marguerite Moreau, Céline's mother. She entered the witness stand supported by her sister, her face marked by grief. "My daughter wasn't perfect," she began, her voice breaking several times. "She made mistakes. She cheated on Laurent, and that was wrong. But she was my child. She was 27 years old and had her whole life ahead of her, and now she's dead because a man decided that his wounded pride was more important than her life." She looked directly at Laurent. "You took everything from me. Céline was all I had after my husband died, and you took her away from me because you couldn't handle the fact that she made a mistake." Laurent lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. On the 5th day of the trial, Maître Leclerc decided to let Laurent testify himself. It was a risk, but she believed the jury needed to see his humanity. Laurent took the stand, his hands trembling slightly. Maître Leclerc asked her questions gently, guiding him through his relationship with Céline, with Mathieu, through the discovery of the betrayal. "What did you feel when you read the diary?" she asked. "I felt like I was dying," Laurent replied. "Everything I had believed in was a lie. The woman I wanted to marry didn't love me. My best friend had betrayed me. And they had been planning it for months. They had been laughing at me. And the moment you walked into the room, I wasn't myself anymore. It was like a dream, but a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I saw my hands, but they weren't mine. I heard their voices, but they sounded far away." Duchamp's cross-examination was relentless. "You say you weren't yourself, but you brought a knife, didn't you?" "Yes." "You drove there with the intention of confronting them?" I don't know what I wanted." "You knew they would be there? Together?" "Yes. And yet you claim it wasn't planned." Laurent was silent for a long time. Then, with a voice that carried resignation, he said, "I wanted them to see the truth. I wanted them to understand what they had done to me. But when I saw them there, laughing, happy while I was dying inside, something inside me broke. The closing arguments were intense, emotional appeals to the jury. Duchamp argued relentlessly. Betrayal does not justify murder. In a civilized society, there are laws, courts, divorces. Laurent Beaumont had options. He chose violence. Maître Leclerc, on the other hand, asked for understanding. This is not a man who wanted to kill. This is a man who was so deeply hurt that his mind broke. The question is not whether he is guilty. He has confessed. The question is, how do we punish someone who became a monster because others made him that way? The jury retired to deliberate. The jurors needed 2 days. 48 hours during which all of France held its breath, during which social media exploded with opinions and speculation, during which Laurent's parents sat in a nearby hotel and prayed, while Marguerite Moreau cried in her apartment in Rennes. At 2 p.m. on September 25th, the jury returned. The courtroom filled once again with the same tense energy. Laurent was led in, his face expressionless, as if he had already stopped hoping or fearing. Judge Mercier addressed the foreman. "Have you reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor." "In the case of the murder of Céline Moreau, what is your verdict?" "Guilty of manslaughter, not first-degree murder." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Marguerite Moreau sobbed loudly. "In the case of the murder of Mathieu Dubois?" "Guilty of manslaughter, not first-degree murder." The jury had decided that Laurent was guilty, but had acted under extreme emotional circumstances that had deprived him of his full sanity. It was neither acquittal nor the harshest punishment, but a middle ground that satisfied no one. Prosecutor Duchamp objected, arguing that the evidence clearly showed intent, but Judge Mercier overruled him. The jury's verdict stood. Sentencing took place a week later. Judge Mercier spoke at length, his words carefully chosen, as if trying to master the impossibility of his task. "Laurent Beaumont, you killed 2 people. Nothing can undo that. No punishment can bring Céline Moreau or Mathieu Dubois back, but this court must also consider the circumstances under which this act was committed." He described the months of deception, the calculated cruelty of the fraud, the psychological torture Laurent had suffered. "This does not excuse what you have done, but it explains it." The sentence was 18 years in prison for both cases, with the sentences to be served concurrently. With good behavior, Laurent could be released on parole after 12 years. "You were a victim before you became a perpetrator," Mercier said, "but you chose to respond to betrayal with murder. That choice destroyed lives, not only those of the victims, but also your own and that of your families. You will have many years to reflect on that choice." Laurent was led away. He looked one last time at his parents, who were sitting in the front row, their faces wet with tears. Isabelle raised her hand in a silent farewell. The years in Fresnes Penitentiary fundamentally changed Laurent. The first few months were dark, marked by suicidal thoughts and complete apathy. He didn't participate in any programs, didn't talk to anyone, existed only as a shadow. The turning point came through an older fellow inmate, Bernard Lefebvre, who was imprisoned for the manslaughter of his wife. Bernard had already served 15 years of his sentence and worked as a mentor for new inmates. "You think you're the only person who's ever been destroyed by betrayal," Bernard said one day, as they sat side by side in the prison library. "But you know what? That doesn't make you special. It makes you human. What makes you special is what you do with it now." Slowly, Laurent began to heal, not from the guilt, which would never go away, but from the self-destruction. He enrolled in a distance learning course in psychology, wanting to understand what had happened in his head, why he had been capable of something that would once have seemed unthinkable to him. He began to write letters, not to his parents, who visited him regularly, but to Marguerite Moreau. Letter after letter he expressed his remorse, acknowledged his guilt, but never asked for forgiveness because he knew he had no right to it. He never sent most of the letters, but the act of writing was therapeutic, forcing him to face his actions instead of running away from them. In 2027, 4 years after the crime, something unexpected happened. Marguerite Moreau wrote back. Not in response to his letters, which she had never received, but on her own initiative. "I hate you," the letter began. "I will always hate you for what you did to my daughter. But I need to know, was any part of her relationship with you real? Did she ever really love you? I need to understand who my daughter was before I can bury her." Laurent replied honestly. He described the good moments, the laughter, the plans for the future. He also described the diary, the emails, the betrayal. "I believe she loved me in her own way," he wrote, "but it wasn't the love I needed. And when I realized that, I broke." What followed was a painful and necessary exchange of letters that lasted several years. Marguerite never forgave Laurent, but she began to understand that tragedies were not simple stories of good and evil, but complex intertwining of human weaknesses. Laurent worked in prison at the counseling center for inmates with relationship problems. He helped other men consumed by jealousy, betrayal, and anger find ways to deal with it without resorting to violence. Some listened to him, others did not, but he tried every day because it was the only thing he could do to make any sense of the senseless. In 2035, 12 years after the murders, Laurent appeared before the parole board. He was now 41 years old, his hair grey, his face marked by years of self-reflection. Monsieur Beaumont, the chairman began, you have behaved in an exemplary manner in prison. You have studied, helped others, shown remorse. But the question remains, are you a danger to society? Laurent answered without hesitation. I was a danger. I was a man who thought love and loyalty defined him, and when those were taken away, I had nothing left to hold on to. Today I know that I am more than what others do to me. I am responsible for my reactions, not for their actions. After 3 hours of deliberation, the commission granted him parole under strict conditions. Laurent left prison on a cold November morning. His parents were waiting at the gate, aged but relieved. They hugged him for a long time, silently. He moved into a small apartment in Montreuil, far from the Marais, far from the places that held memories. He found work at a non-profit organization that helped victims of domestic violence, using his psychology degree to show others a way out of the darkness. Every March 5th, Laurent visited the Père Lachaise cemetery, where Céline and Mathieu were buried, their graves only a few meters apart. He brought flowers, spoke softly to them, did not ask for forgiveness, but simply remembered what had been and what could have been. The story of Laurent Beaumont became a teaching aid, discussed in law courses, psychology seminars, and ethics classes. What drives a person to violence? How much provocation is too much? Where is the line between victim and perpetrator? There were no easy answers. There were only the ruins of lives that could never be put back together again, and the question Laurent asked himself every day, if he could go back, would he act differently? He wanted to believe he would, but in his most honest moments he didn't know.